and welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm Dr. Audrey Tang.
And I'm Judith Crozier.
And this is the show where we don't have hot takes or top tips. Well, we do have top tips, but not quite in the way that we see on social media. We have real expert-led conversation that is accessible and applicable to everyday life. So if you want well-being tools without having to be perfect, this is the show for you. And this week we are bringing back another of our favourite guests. We love our guests. It's Professor Sharron Hinchliff. She is a professor at the University of Sheffield. She is the founder of the Sexual Rights Charter for older adults, because it's really important that sex and intimacy remains a part of well-being throughout the lifespan. But today it's a little bit special because we're going to be talking about men's sexual health.
Yeah.
Now, this is a topic which we need to cover because we talk a lot about women's sexual health. Menopause, all of those things, not a problem we talk about. But when it comes to men's sexual health, if I say that to you, what's the first sexual problem that comes to mind, or the only sexual problem that comes to mind?
I suppose impotence, would be the one that we would think about.
Exactly, erectile dysfunction, that's it. There are more things than that.
Yes.
And it goes deeper than that. And there's a lot more that I think all of us need to talk about. So when it comes to, I guess, sexual health across the lifespan, are you even comfortable? Because I'm not particularly comfortable talking about sex with my husband. And that's my own sexual health. I don't even ask about his. Do you have a similar sort of thing?
Yeah, it's very similar. I think it's just society and probably all of our cultures, or men, or most of them. I don't really know anybody that's really comfortable to talk with their partner, kind of in the cold light of day. That sort of, like you would just discuss what shopping we're getting. You know, we should be able to do it in the same way, but we can't really.
Yeah, and it's almost easier for women. We talk about menopause, we'll come into the studio, we will talk about certain things quite freely, but I don't think men have a space for that because it can feel creepy or odd.
And I think that so much of their innate maleness is kind of bound up with it, so that even we know people that hold male-only groups, so that there's the freedom and the safety for men to talk about whatever they want to talk about. But even in those groups, I don't know, no one's ever told me, and neither should they. But I imagine that's still probably quite difficult for them to talk about.
Yeah.
Even there.
I agree. And actually, if you do feel like sharing that these discussions are had or not had, please let us know in the comments.
Yeah.
But we can't wait to get this conversation started, so let us bring on Professor Sharron Hinchliff. Welcome to the show, Sharron. It's great to chat with you, and it's always insightful and interesting, and we can't wait to dive in.
Oh, thank you. I'm so pleased to be back because, you know, giving a platform to this important topic does really mean a lot to me.
Oh, it's our pleasure to support that. And in particular, this topic, because we don't talk enough about men's sexual health. And so when we come into talking about older men's sexual health, sexuality, what stereotypes or assumptions tend to dominate? We've already discussed the first thing we think of is impotence or erectile dysfunction, but what also do those narratives miss when we just think about the stereotype?
Yeah, I think that's a really good starting question, because there are stereotypes in society about individuals across the board, and they're quite interesting when it comes to being older, and especially when they're gendered stereotypes. And some of the key ones in relation to being an older man are that, you know, you get older and you lose interest in sexual activity, or you can no longer function and be sexually active, or there's also this kind of contrasting stereotype that you remain virile forever as well. And I think these stereotypes can be quite challenging to navigate because they're contradictory. And because of that, I think they can be quite damaging as well. And I always give the example of people I've talked to in my research projects, because I am a researcher rather than a therapist. So all the information I get is through having conversations with people as part of research projects or any other type of sort of engagement activities. And I've heard quite many times that older men want to seek professional help for a sexual issue, but they're worried about actually asking that question because they're worried about how they will be seen. They don't want to be seen as a dirty old man. You know, what do you why are you showing interest in sex at this age? So I think those stereotypes are very prevalent. They've been around for a very long time, and they're still having an impact on, you know, men's mental health and well-being.
And you've really mentioned quite a heartbreaking thing,
Yeah.
that a man themselves will sit there and not want to ask because they are afraid of being seen as a dirty old man. And we know from conversations with you that sexual intimacy, or intimacy in general, is so important across that lifespan. So on that, from that sexual rights perspective, why is it so important that we do take this seriously? Because we tend to have the two extremes. You've almost got these stand-up comedy jokes about it, the trivializing, the hot takes on Instagram kind of thing, and then very, very medicalized. We use all the correct terms and the right words.
Yes.
We're not casually speaking about it. So why do we need to do this more?
Yeah, I think, again, another great question, because I think there is a silence that's around the topic. We have expectations that men might be talking about it, but in the kind of way that you've described. But when you're actually taught to men in sort of legitimate research projects, you find out that that's not always the case. So there's a bit of a silence around the topic, and I think the silence can breed misinformation, it can breed myths, it can sort of lead to a sense of shame, you know, and a stigma as well. From sexual rights perspective, and that's the one that I kind of propose for everyone across the life course, but in terms of getting older, you know, I think it's really important to recognise that we shouldn't be treated differently just because we're getting older. We shouldn't be treated differently around our sexuality just because we might have a health condition or a disability. And that, you know, sexual rights in terms of our sexual well-being really do apply to everyone. It is about making sure that people are being treated with dignity and respect when it comes to sexuality, and about opening those conversations so that people can have an open and honest conversation if they so wish. I know that not everyone will want to. It is a bit of a sensitive topic, but we like to, you know, be able to provide a space for people to have conversations if that's what they want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what might be some of the common psychological or emotional sexual difficulties that men face, but often can't talk about openly?
Yeah. So we hear a lot about erectile dysfunction. I think we've already mentioned that already, haven't we? And it tends to be the big one that we hear about.
Yeah.
And I think the visibility of that and the sort of the way that people can talk about it, because it does give us an in. It does give men an in to talk about sexual dysfunction, because you can't just talk about that little blue pill or the, you know, the erection enhancing pills, which we know about, that you can now get over the counter in the UK. So that's the most common one, and there might be a bit of ease talking about that just because of the resources available to support that. But then men can experience other sexual issues as they get older. There are issues around ejaculation. I think we might have talked about dry orgasm before, but then there's premature ejaculation. There's not being able to finish, as the saying goes, and these can be really, really, you know, upsetting for men to experience. We also don't really talk about sexual desire in men. It tends to be talked about as a woman's issue. So women get older, get to menopause, start losing sexual desire. But it's just something men can experience as well. And, you know, we really do need to talk about the whole gamut, I think, of sexual issues and sexual changes that we can experience, either as a result of getting older or just as a result of life, or just as a result of, you know, our health, our mental and physical health. And that way, you know, if we do have conversations about it, it can help to reduce that stigma and those feelings of shame that I've mentioned already.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And many men equate sexuality with performance. So what can happen to their sexual identity when performance starts to, you know, fall away or becomes less predictable?
Yeah. So just to clarify for anyone listening, that we're talking about sexual performance, so the ability to be able to function sexually. And I think we have, as a society, kind of taught men that sex is something that you do. You know, it's something that you do perform.
Performance.
Yes.
It's true. It's true. That is the word.
Yeah. So if we can't, for any reason, that can have an impact on our sense of self. And I know that through speaking to numerous men that experience difficulties, they can experience like a loss of masculinity, feeling less like a man. And I think that is partly related to society encouraging men to see themselves through this lens of sexual prowess, if you like. So what we're talking about here are those gendered societal expectations about sexuality and about aging, and I think they're really powerful. So that when they do break down, they can have a massive impact on how we see ourselves. I know women have talked about similar things as well. Women, younger women that we've interviewed as a research project, they've experienced a loss of desire, and they've felt that that's impacted their sense of femininity. So I know,
Oh, wow.
excuse me, I know that it can be across the board.
Okay.
That's, it's just when you were talking, you're absolutely right. I immediately just used the word sexual performance.
Yes.
As related to men.
Yes.
I never use sexual
No.
performance when it comes to women.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And that is so common in our dialogue, even as professionals as well. So thank you for bringing that up and actually clarifying
Absolutely, yeah. And it's it really did need clarifying because it's a subtle difference, but it's a difference nonetheless.
Absolutely. We are keeping you, Sharon, and we're going to be right back after a tip from Professor Sharron last time she was on the show.
Okay. We tend to think of these things as sort of women's problems. If we think about sexual desire loss, we think about women. If we think about orgasm problems, we think about women. And we forget that these issues can affect men as well. So I think, it's a really important topic to address men beyond that erection kind of sphere and think about those issues, but also our self-esteem as well, because that's one of the biggest things that can influence our sexual desire is our own self-esteem. And we have something that's called a sexual self-esteem that quite simply is what we think about our own self, how we think about ourselves, how we think about what we value and how we perceive ourselves. Then that can have an influence on whether or not we feel like we should be engaging in a sexual relationship with someone, or how we feel like about getting naked with someone. And, there's a massive psychology to our sexual expression and enjoyment.
Welcome back to Mental Health Matters. We are talking with Professor Sharron Hinchliff about men's sexual well-being across the lifespan. And we've already unpacked a phrase which we're commonly using, which is sexual performance, as actually a phrase that can be doing a lot more harm than good. So let's talk about long-term relationships. How do sexual changes as men get older affect intimacy at the same time as the partner is also making and navigating those changes? So many, I think, couples, they are around the same age. It's not that massive age gap kind of thing, so one person's doing one thing, another person's doing something else. But in this case, everybody's navigating changes themselves. How does that affect men, and is there anything that they can do about that?
Yeah. So I think long-term relationships are quite interesting in themselves because when we look at the research, there is quite a large body of evidence that tells us about the sexual changes that can take place in long-term relationships. But there might not be necessarily sexual problems or sexual difficulties. There's just kind of, I mean, it could be a problem if it's sexual boredom, for example, but for other couples, that's not always the case. Their sex life changes. They might sort of have a pattern of intimacy, which they're both quite comfortable with. And I think as long as people are comfortable with those changes, then that's when it's not a problem. But, I think it can be challenging if you want to retain your sexual life in a long-term relationship and there is a sexual problem, because sometimes it can have an impact on the actual sort of just general levels of intimacy within that relationship, because there can be a fear of leading the partner on. Now, one partner who's got the sexual issue, if they're experiencing loss of sexual desire or erectile dysfunction, they might actually be a bit concerned about sort of giving the partner a hug or being intimate in any other ways, because they know they can't do the end product, if you like, the actual intercourse or whatever sexual activity they want to do. And that can be really, really difficult within a relationship, because if it means something to those people, if it's important to them, then to be denied that aspect of their relationship is quite distressing and have an impact on excuse me, I keep choking in the morning. It can have an impact on psychological well-being. So this is the reason why at the start I think I mentioned it's important to be able to have conversations about this topic and bring that out of the shadows, because it is pretty normal. A lot of people do experience these differences and these changes, and just being too afraid to talk about it can have massive implications for the relationship and their well-being.
Because you can see how a pattern could lay down. It could be that a man is struggling with his own sexual well-being, and then therefore doesn't start intimacy or anything with the partner, and then the partner then thinks, who's maybe going through the menopause, I'm unattractive, and that leads to other misunderstandings or incorrect narratives.
Yeah, exactly.
In the head, and then that can cause problems. So I guess that leads me to the next question. What sort of misunderstandings have you seen, maybe in research, that do arise when male sexual difficulties or male vulnerabilities are not talked about, or they're just dismissed or seen as trivial? What have you seen?
Yeah. I think that question follows on really well from the previous one, and I know that sometimes we are caught within our own heads and inventing our own story about what's going on, because I think when there's a silence, when it's not talked about, it can lead to a lot of unanswered questions. And as a result of that, the partners can feel rejected, they might feel unloved, there might be, disruption, tension and arguments. And in some cases, there might be suspicion like, are they having an affair? Have they got a new relationship? Or don't they love me anymore? So all of those concerns can really come to the fore when these misunderstandings are occurring within a relationship. And I know I'm talking about having communication with each other, but I do recognise that it is a very difficult topic to talk about, and it is very emotional as well at the same time, and it feels kind of risky, because you risk sort of revealing a part of yourself that you wouldn't normally do by having those conversations. So there's a lot of reasons why it's not an easy topic to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there particular and maybe different challenges faced by single men or divorced or widowed men that we don't talk about enough?
I think so, definitely, yes. And it is something that I hear about quite a lot.
Okay.
I've heard about it from a woman's perspective as well, but men do talk to me about this. And it's kind of like a form of bereavement, if you like, a sexual bereavement, where people really feel that loss of intimacy and miss that kind of physical touch. We know that physical touch is really, really powerful, that it has benefits for our well-being. It can help us with a sense of feeling better and just general healing. And then there's the bonding and connection that comes from that. And it's interesting to look into research studies that have explored touch deprivation, because that has been linked to sort of mental health and behavioural problems, such as issues around our body image satisfaction, increased levels of anxiety and lower quality of life. So I think these are the challenges that can be experienced if you are single and you do want a partner, or you do miss the comfort of the partner that you can't be with at the time.
Yeah.
Really sad.
It's a really hard one, isn't it?
We don't think of that.
No, I have to say it's not something that I've really thought about, but I am now.
Yeah, because almost the stereotype out there, and I think films have a lot more to do with this.
Yeah.
It's always the woman who struggles with, am I attractive enough? Am I this? Am I that? When she's divorced or widowed or whatever. Somehow the man seems to just be fine.
Yes, just fine. And quite a lot of times they'll be the one that will meet somebody in a film or whatever.
Yeah.
And sort of be saved, if you like.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Interesting.
So, thinking about different cultures, different sexual orientation or class, do aging, sexuality and masculinity, do they intersect differently in different cultures and sexual orientations, and how might we see those played out?
Yes, they do indeed. Sorry, this is it's a fascinating area of research.
Okay, wow.
Only recently I've been reading about this topic in gentlemen that live in Saudi Arabia, so that has been a really interesting piece of research to read. But we do know that sort of masculinity, well, our ideas about masculinity and about sexuality and about age do differ according to different cultures and, you know, so our different sort of backgrounds and our upbringings. And I guess one way that plays out is if, you know, if as a society we see conversation about sex as taboo, especially, you know, in terms of older adults, or if we haven't received any sex education or don't provide any sex education, then there's no conversations about the topic. And men increasingly are reaching out to social media for advice and information, but that is not always useful.
No.
And you know, as with everything, it can be a source of misinformation. And one of the most worrying aspects is that it can actually reinforce social stereotypes about masculinity. You know, the idea that men are always ready to go, if you like, at the drop of a hat. But thinking about the research in Saudi Arabia that was recently published, that the authors were arguing that because the topic is really unspoken about amongst men, as well as amongst women, that men had an increased level of concern about their sexual performance and also about their penis size. And the authors argued that this was being driven by the fellas watching porn and comparing themselves to actors.
Oh no.
Yeah, so that is the sex education that they get in is coming from a source that's probably not reliable, and it's not giving any kind of meaningful comparison.
It's not realistic either, is it?
It's not realistic.
No.
Yeah. So that was actually making the situation worse for the men in terms of the well-being around their own sexual expression and their sexual function.
Oh gosh, and that's even before we even talk about LGBTQ communities and so on, which I think, you know, we do need to have a whole other show on, because I think that's really important.
Yes.
Yeah, I never even thought about that, because of course if you can't get your information from a respected source or regulated source, you're going to find it somewhere else, because people are curious. Oh my gosh. Professor Sharron, we are keeping you, and we will be back just after we hear Professor Sharron talk to us about how to access the Sexual Rights Charter.
So if anyone's interested in finding out more about the Sexual Rights Charter and how they can use that to support the work that they do, please just go over to agesexandrights.com and have a look at what the information that's there. We've got some examples of the work that we've already done. We've got some examples of what the charter actually looks like. And there's a contact me form as well. So if you fill in that contact me, I'll get in touch with you and then we can share the charter materials with you.
Welcome back to Mental Health Matters, where we're having a really interesting discussion with Dr. Sharron Hinchliff about men and sex broadly. It's really interesting discussion, because it's not something that we would generally think about, is it? So men who find it difficult to talk about this subject, what kind of language or environments would make it easier for men to talk about their sexual difficulties without feeling diminished?
So it's really important that we are able to have open and honest conversations about our sexuality. But like you say, we do need to think about the how and the where that we do those. And something really interesting that I find is that men don't always open up in a kind of face-to-face way, but they might open up in a side-by-side way. And by that I mean that they might feel safer connecting and having conversations about sensitive topics when they're doing something. So perhaps, you know, driving in the car. I know I've heard people talk about if you want to have a conversation with your child about something that they won't talk to you about, just ask them while you're in the car. But there's also activities like, you know, maybe building something or, you know, going fishing or just basically doing something. And I think that this is where the concept of the men's sheds come in really, really well, because that's a place where men are not just going and sitting and talking in groups. They are going and actually doing things. They are creating things. They're working with their hands, or they're working out in the fields. And that is perhaps maybe a conducive environment to have a conversation. You're not putting people on the spot, and it can be a general kind of conversation. But I guess in terms of healthcare in a professional context, well, Movember last year, they released some guidance to sexuality, and Movember is the sort of month that's focused predominantly on men's health issues.
Yes.
They were talking about prostate cancer and prostate health last year. And they put in the guide that sexual health and sexual well-being should be a regular part of clinical care. And I think that's really important to consider, you know, across the board, not just in relation to our prostate, men's prostate, but in relation to general checkups.
Interesting. So if you were to go for a men's health checkup at your GP, is that something they would bring into the discussion?
I don't think they do, but I think it would be a good idea to think about that.
Yes, yeah.
Agreed, yeah.
Make it sort of normalises it as well, doesn't it?
It does.
So what would you like society to understand better about men's sexuality in later life?
I think to recognise that these stereotypes exist, and they are what they are. They are stereotypes.
Yes.
That sometimes they can be really damaging because they're giving us false expectations about what it means to be an older man. But I think we need to make sure that we're busting those myths. You know, let's get rid of the idea that all men, you know, are going to get erectile dysfunction, because they're not. I think it's around 30-40% of men when they get into their 60s do experience erectile dysfunction, and that can increase as we get older. There's also an assumption that all men will lose interest in sexual activity, and they won't. Then there's the assumption I talked about earlier that, you know, that men stay virile forever, but not all men will. We've got to recognise that there's that diversity in terms of men's aging sexuality, and also that men can accommodate the changes to their sexual lives. I've spoken with quite a few that have done, you know, really well. It might have been a bit of a difficult situation to accept and adapt to, but if there's been a change in their sexual function or their sexual life because of their health or because of their partner's health, then they've adapted to that and worked it out between them as a couple. And I think that's really, really important to recognise, because it's sexual activity is not just about sex, is it? It's about the other things that go with it. It's about the affection. It's about the connection. It's about the intimacy, you know, and all the things that come with that, such as the boost to our self-esteem, you know, the sort of strengthening our bonds and things like that. So it's not just about the sexual act.
Now, what's really interesting is, I know we've talked about this before. We've always said if the menopause, if the world was run by women, we would have dealt with menopause a lot sooner, but because it's run by men, we don't deal with it. But actually, it feels like there are many male politicians, there are many male politicians making the rules on public policy, on practice, public discourse, all of those things. What do they actually need to change? Because we're not having these conversations, and yet this is going to affect them. This will affect Sir Keir Starmer. This will affect Boris Johnson. It will affect all of these people in power, even Donald Trump, you know? So, what do they need to do to change public policy and practice and discussion?
I'm really pleased that you've asked that, Audrey, because I've been having a little snoop around, and it was only I think it was November last year when the UK government released its men's sexual health strategy, which is their 10-year vision for men's health. And that does talk about sexual health and sexual well-being. So that is a really big step in the right direction. It talks about sexual dysfunction, talking about sexual desire, arousal, ejaculation. And it also talks about lifestyle factors that can have an impact on men's sexual well-being. So that is definitely a step in the right direction. And I think it's taken us away from the perspective of viewing sexual well-being as a add-on luxury and instead a quality of life issue.
Yes, that is a huge thing.
It's a massive thing.
Because there's two aspects of well-being that I know, 'cause like yourself, I've been in the field, but I've been in the general field of well-being for 12 years. The two things that are missing, financial well-being and sexual well-being. We do not talk about those two enough. And over the 12 years, I've seen it change, but it's interesting that they have been add-ons. Oh, and we'll just add on a little bit about budgeting here, you know, and add on a bit about menopause there, kind of thing. So sort of on that note, you've been practicing in this field, you're hugely experienced in this field. What gives you hope when it comes to the changes you've seen, however slow they've been? And I know many of them you've been pioneering yourself, but what gives you hope when it comes to the future of sexual well-being? Maybe not just for men, but in general.
I think just seeing the recognition of sexual well-being in those key kind of policy-making documents, like the men's the men's health strategy, and then the women's one that preceded that, and that talks about sexual well-being as well. So it's really important to have visibility and to have conversations, and hopefully they will guide practice. So I guess in terms of older adults, which is my field, it's that it seems to be slower, the progress in relation to that. And I don't know whether it's because of, this kind of ageism that's really embedded and it's hard to shift. And every year, I think we sort of take a little chunk and we manage to sort of diminish it a little bit, but then it comes back and flourishes and people find it not a very nice topic to talk about. So I'd like to see that eradicated completely. I'd like to see the myths about our sexual aging completely diminished, and I'd like to see people feel comfortable to be able to talk about sexual well-being and aging in a way that doesn't make people feel stigmatized or as though they're doing something wrong or as they're dirty or anything like that, as though they shouldn't talk about it, because quite simply when it comes to younger people, that doesn't exist. There's other reasons why we might sort of have conversations about younger people and sex, and it might make them feel a little bit uncomfortable. They're stigmatized, but for very different reasons for the conversations that we have about older adults, which are quite simply based on their age.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a shame, isn't it? Because it's hard enough to talk about anyway, and then when you add age into it, and people then feel, like you said before, they can feel ashamed about talking about it just because they're older. That's just so sad.
And this is why it's just such a pleasure to chat with you, Professor Sharron, because I really believe that researchers and academics, we're not just there to give the information. I found this in research. And you are a great example of being an advocate, of going out there and actually changing how we see things in society. And I think that's another responsibility of academics that we don't often talk about. But you're just such a great example of it. And it's just a pleasure to learn from you. So thank you.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you very much. And where can we learn more about you?
Okay, so I've got two websites that you might want to check out.
Yes.
The first one is sharonhinchliff.com and the second one is agesexandyou.com. So
Brilliant.
They do link in with each other, so if you find one, you'll be able to find the other one.
Amazing, amazing. Well, we would love to have you back on the show again. I think there's so much more to talk about. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
We'll head over to Test the Trend. On this week's Test the Trend, this is where we give you a challenge for the week, and this is a really simple challenge. So I'm going to just do it on Jude, and then you can see how this works, or hear how this works if you're listening to us on podcast. This is called Swap the Word Challenge. So when you hear the word, I'm just checking my microphone, it is on. When you hear the word male sexual problems, what do you think?
I mean, still impotence or erectile dysfunction.
Yeah, that's it. So We're going to replace the word problem
Yes.
with change. Male sexual changes.
Oh, okay.
Now what do you think?
I think of perhaps not wanting to be sexual as often.
Yes.
That would be a change as you get older.
Absolutely. And you might even think things like losing your hair or putting on weight, all of those other things.
Yeah.
The change of just using the word change instead of problem suddenly makes the discussion so much broader. So that's my challenge for you. If you're using the word problems, use the word changes, see what opens up in your mind. Welcome back to the last part of Mental Health Matters. It is always a lovely time to reflect on what we've learned today. I love Professor Sharron.
She's amazing.
She's brilliant, isn't she?
Yeah, she really is.
And she's such an advocate.
Yes.
And that is important because I think research can find out so much, and that's great. But research tends to stay in its paper or in its little book somewhere, but she's doing something actively with those findings and making changes to policy, and I think that's brilliant. Yeah,
she's sort of bringing that research alive, isn't she? And really, as you say, advocating for it. She's really great because you can see the enthusiasm she has for everything she talks about.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me was from your question about the cultural differences. It didn't even occur to me that some cultures just didn't have conversations at all, not even school conversations, because you're almost a bit aware I think you have the lesson of put the condom on the cucumber.
Well, but yes.
Some places
don't have that, no.
And the more secretive it gets, almost the worse it becomes, because if you're secretive about it, then people add their own story onto what that is.
Yeah.
So, gosh.
It's something I honestly hadn't thought about, but Professor Sharron's example kind of really clarified the difficulties that some cultures must have.
Yeah, and then if that's all tied up with your identity, how on earth can you talk about any changes?
Yes.
What else struck you today?
Just that there might be minute changes, in policy and society, kind of just starting, talking about men's sexual changes, which is great. Yes. And obviously anything like that takes a while to filter through, but there's a sort of glimmer of light. And just how difficult it is for some men to talk about this. That's what really struck me, because it's not something I've really ever thought about. But it really hit me how difficult it must be for a lot of men to talk about.
Because it's something so personal, and so wrapped up with identity sometimes, I think.
Yes.
And it's true. And it is really interesting that having these side-by-side conversations is one thing that can work. Oh my goodness. Well, there's a lot to think about there, and please feel free to share any comments. There is space for that if you're watching this one on YouTube or LinkedIn Live. And from all of us here at Mental Health Matters, have a healthy week.